All right. So while I get set up, joining us now is Daniel Bessner. He's an S tier TMBS guest. People probably know who should be familiar with his work.
Hmm.
He is the Joff Hanauer Honors Associate Professor in Western Civilization at the University of Washington, an intellectual historian of U.S. foreign relations. He is the author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer, and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual, a great book that I actually read last summer.
Oh, nice.
Um, and
That
what was that?
that makes two of us. You tripled my sales by buying a copy.
Let me just give a short pitch. Is like, the Rand Institute intellectual history is great, but people might not know there's a Frankfurt School stuff in there too. There's a wide swath of intellectual history you get in that book. So I recommend that. He's also a contributor to Jacobin and the excellent Foreign Exchanges Substack,
Yes.
which informed a lot of this interview. Run by Derek Davison, which I am a subscriber to. Daniel Bessner, thanks for joining Left Reckoning.
Thank you, my two beautiful boys. It's the very beginning of your new venture. I'm so excited and honored to be such an early guest. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you. I think, it feels very good to have you on. So, to start it off, let's go to a conversation I think we've had similar with you, but the Democrats now are in the position to return to what Biden's been calling leadership, world leadership. We're going to return to this. Talk a little bit about what we can expect from this return to world leadership.
Sure. So I think that's one thing that's really important just to understand generally is about the foreign policy bureaucracy is actually not as institutionalized in a particular way in the sense that once a new president comes, they write a memo, literally a memo, and that is supposed to kind of lay out how they want foreign policy to be undertaken, like who's going to be most powerful, who's going to be responsible for X, Y, and Z. So in some sense, we just fundamentally don't know what that memo is going to look like, right? What responsibilities X or Y is going to get. There's an incredible amount of discretionary power, particularly in the executive. So be that as it may, I just want to make that, maybe there's some wacky memo that's coming that we don't know what'll happen. But so I just wanted to get that out of the way. But the thing is, you also have to examine, what is the president himself? What are they doing? What type of president is Joe Biden likely to be? Is he likely to be someone who is going to be very involved in the details of what's going on in his administration? Or is he not likely to be someone who is going to be very involved in that way? My prediction is that he's probably not going to be someone who's particularly involved in the details. One, because he's never really been that sort of politician throughout the duration of his career. And two, he's obviously experiencing some form of cognitive decline. And that cognitive decline is not going to be improved with 5,000 things coming at him every day when he's president. So I imagine a lot of the foreign policy, which is not going to be at the front of his mind, is going to be undertaken by a lot of his appointments. So the question then is, who is he appointed? So you have Tony Blinken, you have Jake Sullivan, you have Samantha Power, you have basically what I would classify as the people who were lower level executives in the Obama administration, people who weren't the absolute principal decision makers like Hillary Clinton or Leon Panetta or Bob Gates or Joe Biden himself, but people who were the assistants to a lot of those people have now been appointed the principals, the people who will actually not just be whispering in Power's ear, but who will be making decisions. So then what do you have to go on? You have to go on what they did during the Obama administration and what they wrote. So on one hand, we don't really 100% know what actually happened in the Obama administration because the very fact is the documents haven't been released. So you can't look at these 5,000 memos and see who actually did what. So what we're relying on is pretty much memoir and reportage. So what does it look like given that? So I would say, and then I'll stop rambling. Sorry, this is a bit long answer, but I just want to sort of contextualize it for everyone. Perfect. So there's a difference between the first Obama administration and the second Obama administration. The first Obama administration was more willing to use force and to basically abide by the traditional status quo of American foreign policy. You get essentially the increase in troops in Afghanistan, and most disastrously, you get the intervention in Libya. The second Obama administration, a little less You don't get when Assad crossed the so-called red line, you don't get then some sort of massive retaliation, which you might have seen in the first time Obama administration. So the question is it going to be more first Obama or more second Obama? I think it's probably likely to be more first Obama administration, because I think the people who he appointed are on the hawkish end of the liberal spectrum. So if you look at Obama's memoir, who are the people who are advocating for intervention in Libya? Who are the people who are advocating to quote unquote do something in Syria? Who are the people who are advocating that you want to like do something about the Arab Spring? Send bombs, send weapons, whatever it may be. And it's mostly people like Blinken, it's Samantha Power, it's Jake Sullivan, it's people like that. So given that, I would say, at least as it stands now, is that it's more likely to be first time Obama. But again, it's not 2008, right? So there is like this real criticism of at least endless war and constant military deployment. That is a genuine thing within the Democratic Party. And the question is, how is that new critique going to interact with people who have spent their careers essentially advocating American intervention in the world? And I think those are the questions that we will face.
I'd be really curious to hear, because you do this very well. What do people like Power and Blinken in particular believe? Their ideology in the sense of like, what do they think America's role in the world is? I think that you talk specifically, the transition from today versus people who came, into power during like the Cold War or developed their political, consciousness during that period of time.
It's a great question. And this is what's, I think, really interesting, because people like Blinken and Power really came of intellectual age after the Cold War, the era of the indispensable nation. So what you have, at least in my historical reading, is a Cold War logic existing in a non-Cold War world. So you have this idea that American military supremacy is the necessary font of peace and prosperity, and that you need a type of U.S. global dominance now that there's no existential ideological enemy to ensure peace and prosperity around the world. And this is what I really think people like Blinken, Sullivan, and Power, they genuinely believe that world peace and prosperity depends on American global leadership. And that sometimes means using military force to intervene to, stop a massacre at Benghazi. That does eventually and very quickly turn into the deposition of Muammar Gaddafi. But, you have to save the babies in Benghazi. And so I think this is what is really important to understand, is that you have people operating with a Cold War logic in a non-Cold War world. Now, maybe, they've come to Jesus in the last 4 years, but that's not what I read, or that's not I understood when they were criticizing Trump. It was all about sort of returning to the status quo ante. This is what people at the Council on Foreign Relations were saying, at the Brookings Institution were saying. And so the question is, how do they navigate that? And we'll see.
And what role does the Cold War with China have in that?
Right. So I think that it's really important to understand that there's a lot of interests that want the United States to remain militarily dominant. It's not just people like Samantha Power and Blinken who don't really, they do make money off of it, Blinken especially, but their main bag is policy. They want to make policy. They want to exercise power. But there's a bunch of interests from defense contractors like Raytheon and Boeing, but even I think this is where it gets thorny, from congressional representatives and even from labor unions and people who work in munitions factories, and maybe not munitions factories, but weapons factories today, who want the maintenance of at least a structure that allows capital to be put towards building the weapons of the American empire. You also have people who are in think tanks like RAND or Brookings, CFR, whomever, who also make their careers off of providing guideposts and a plan for this very American empire. And so you have this large coalition of forces that is organized around the maintenance of the status quo. So what does this have to do with the new Cold War with China? What's better than a new Cold War to provide essentially a justifying logic for the consistent maintenance of an American imperial system, both abroad with the famous 750 military bases, but also at home where you get the building of the F-35, you get all of this pork going to underpopulated regions throughout the country, et cetera, et cetera. So what a new Cold War with China does is it provides a sort of logic to allow that to go. The difference is that, unlike the old Cold War, is that there's really an economic imbrication between the United States and China in a way that there wasn't between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's some trade, there's not like there's nothing, but the type of economic connections between the U.S. and China just dwarf what happened during the first Cold War. So the question is, how do policymakers sort of thread that needle with advocating this, war against this ideology, against this evil empire, when there's serious economic intertwinement that really neither country, as it currently stands, is able to walk away from without devastating consequences. China still wants to continue to develop. It still wants to continue to improve its middle class, especially because at this point, when there's no one who really believes in the CCP any longer, the Chinese, the party itself and Xi himself, their legitimacy rests on expanding the middle class. So they can't really just detach from the United States. And similarly, the United States for decades now, and we see this in sort of the emphasis on consumption, it's a consumer society. And the only way that we're able to consume as much as we do is because of countries like China and their ability to produce cheap goods because of their awful labor conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So they can't really separate. So then what does that mean for a new Cold War? And I think we're going to find out.
Well, I would just sort of, piggyback off of that and say, one thing that I think is unique about the moment that we're living in, comparing it to the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, is that you had an ideological battle with the Soviet Union, battle okay, we need to be on top or else they'll come and take over society, take away our freedoms. China is really interesting because there's a kind of pop understanding that the reason that we are in economic decline, the reason that the standard of living in the United States for working people has gone down is because China is taking all the jobs from us, right? And they're basically cheating, which does create an interesting intellectual development, politically at least, domestically in the United States, for people think that something has to be done about China that is in a little bit of a different logic than just saber rattling and saying we need to defeat the upcoming empire.
Right, because there's a real constituency here that more or less believes that their own degraded economic position is directly linked to China.
Yeah, it's China. It's not globalization, right? It's not like the United States' role in undermining these systems across the globe. It's actually just China.
Right, which is why what Trump did do, he had, as you guys know, he had tariff policies in China, right? He didn't really try to arrest globalization. He tried to, prevent steel imports or whatever it may be. And so and this is something that Steve Bannon, himself has focused on for years, this whole China thing. Now, the question is, how does that sort of interact with the QAnon conspiracy, which is, seems to be ever more powerful, particularly during COVID, which isn't quite the same thing. I don't know. There's sort of a miasma of conspiracy theory on the contemporary right, and China is definitely there for the taking. And it'll be interesting to see what Joe Biden does or doesn't do with that. Yeah.
I got this clip where Biden, this was from July 2019, Biden talking about forever wars. And I think we just play that and then talk about Afghanistan, maybe.
Long past time we end the forever wars, which have cost us untold blood and treasure. I have long argued that we should bring home the vast majority of our combat troops from the wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East and narrowly focus on our mission to deal with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the region.
So, Daniel, you think there's how do you read that?
Right. So this is actually, Biden has been advocating something along these lines for a long time. What is referred to in sort of the literature as a counterterrorism policy, which is kind of different. It's not as intense as a nation building policy, but it's kind of approaching terrorism as a police issue. So what does that mean? It means less troops on the ground, and it means American money, American military advisors, and American developed tech basically spread throughout the world to prevent, supposed terrorism. And of course, unsurprisingly, a lot of countries around the world have recognized that if you say the word terrorism, then you're gonna, the American pocketbook will open to you. So what that essentially means is, it's actually kind of analogous to drones. So you get this sort of liberal move to clean war, where you get proxies to undertake what you want to be done, or you pay people to do what you want to do without putting American lives, putting American people on the ground. And, this could go very bad. And I just want to highlight The Intercept, their recent story about the CIA-trained Afghan death squads that have gone around, killed at least 51 billion people, including boys as young as 8, children, very, very young children. And that's the type of thing that, let fewer boots on the ground lead to in the absence of an actual anti-imperial structural policy. So I think we'll see something along those lines. And why I say it's analogous to drones is that it's these approaches and strategies that don't require massive amounts of people or massive amounts of money.
Interesting, yeah. And like Pompeo's recent sanctioning of Iran, you write, I think it was on the Foreign Exchanges, that the key is like whether Biden requires new conditions from Iran before going back in the deal. Is that right? Or how are you looking at the Iran deal under this administration?
Right. So the question, I mean, if I were Iran, I wouldn't necessarily be too eager to get into another deal with the United States. So the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was, Obama did force Iran to do that with heavy sanctions for years and years and years. And there are sanctions still on Iran now. But then the question the Iranian government has to ask itself is, related to a lot of its internal politics about its legitimacy and things along those lines. But let's just take the strategic level. Can they really trust the United States? Right. I mean, what Trump genuinely did do was demonstrate that a new president, at the norm of presidents abiding by deals that were signed by earlier presidents no longer holds in a real serious way. So if you're Iran, what does that mean? I think it's difficult for them to say that we shouldn't pursue a nuclear weapon. And then, there's the whole old argument made by the famous IR theorist Kenneth Waltz, which is that, and you hear kind of echoes of it in realists today, like Steve Walt, and Steve, if I'm misquoting you, I misunderstand, but Ken Waltz definitely made this argument, which was that nuclear proliferation was actually safer because it actually prevents the types of Iraq-type action, the Libya-type action, the Afghanistan-type action that the United States could just go around the world like a 600-pound gorilla. And I imagine that what North Korea was able to successfully do, which is to get a nuclear capability, and now the United States is not nearly as safe or rattling with North Korea as it was in the early 2000s. I imagine a lot of world leaders are looking at that, and they're going to, and Iran being one of them, going to more forcefully try to get that weapon. And this is also, of course, related to what the United States does. It's interesting because I think you are beginning to see amongst sort of the cognoscente of the American foreign policy establishment, this sort of like assumption that the United States is not going to be in the Middle East forever, that American interests just aren't strong enough there. Famously, a lot of the oil mostly goes to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if the United States does say we don't really have a dog in the Saudi-Iranian fight in a serious way, and that, Israel's strong enough, as the 51st state to rely on U.S. protection, you could also see a ratcheting up of Iranian attempts to get a nuclear weapon. I mean, that's what I would guess Iran gets a breakout capability in the next 10, 15 years, maybe even sooner, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, that lesson, the North Korean lesson, really kind of rings in people's ears, I think, at this point. Of
course. Saddam was overthrown. Gaddafi was overthrown, and Gaddafi was welcomed back into the international community because he gave up his nuclear program. I mean, that was really, to what degree does that really matter? I don't know. But if you're a third, I'm using the Cold War term, if you're a leader in the global South and you're looking at the world and you're seeing who gets deposed and who doesn't, it's pretty obvious.